Tonight we are going to discuss the more practical aspect of this topic. The topic in general is the evolution of the cosmos, and we have seen from the cosmos to the divine spark how all this is involved in a process of evolution. So now we are going to see what we can do to go along this process of evolution. Of course, the process of evolution itself is very complex, so what I'm going to say is just some aspects of it. I'm choosing a particular aspect of the evolution of the divine spark, which is what we are going to share tonight. And we can start with a little recap from the previous talks. We have seen that the divine spark in human beings, which is in the Theosophical literature is called the monad, is composed of, at the beginning of the evolution, of two principles, which is not true. Monad means one. Atman is just the universal being or beingness, and Buddhi is that which reflects the universal being. So when we talk about the monad, we are talking about Buddhi. Buddhi is the first something that reflects that is universal. So when we say Atma Buddhi, we are not really saying that there are two principles. We are saying that the one reality, which is Atman, is reflected in the differentiated universe in Buddhi. So technically speaking, we could say that Buddhi is the monad. But let us take the whole thing as Atma Buddhi. We said that Atman is, being the real, is beyond consciousness and unconsciousness. It's something that cannot be cognized by what is relative. We can perceive the reflection of Atman in ourselves, but the ultimate Atman, we are, and the only way to know what it is to be that, although we always are. But there is a whole thing about being able to be with awareness or be without awareness of the reality. We are not going to deal with all these things that are more in depth. Now, we were saying Atman is beyond consciousness and unconsciousness. Buddhi is a universal, unitive consciousness. Therefore, it's not an individual consciousness. Everything in the universe has a certain aspect or manifestation of consciousness. This is according to the Theosophical view. From atom to stars, they all have a kind of consciousness. When we say consciousness, we are not talking about human consciousness, the human kind of consciousness. I usually define consciousness as the ability to respond to the environment. You know, if you faint, you are unconscious on this level, on the physical level, because you cannot interact with the environment. So an atom is conscious in the sense of the atom is able to interact with other atoms there. And for example, Annie Besant gives an example of the oxygen, which is usually unaware of the hydrogen in normal conditions. So you have oxygen here and hydrogen, and they don't interact with each other. But in certain conditions, the oxygen becomes aware of the hydrogen, and then they interact. We could say in the same way, you know, right now there are a lot of things here of which we are not aware. So in certain conditions, we may become aware of these things, and then we establish a relationship. The same with anything in the universe. And the reason why we can say that which the oxygen experiences can be called consciousness is because those who see the more ultimate principles, they see that that very same quality, which we call chemical affinity at the level of the atoms, as forms evolve, that quality develops into what we call consciousness. So it's the same seed that is there. So the idea is that Buddhi is this universal consciousness that pervades everything, even the atoms. Now, when the process of evolution brings this universal monad, because at this point, as we said, neither Atman nor Buddhi have a personal or an individual consciousness. So when the process of evolution brings the monad into the human form, what happens is that this monad is connected with another principle that is called manas. Manas is a principle of mind, and also the principle of self-consciousness. So it is when the monad gets in touch with manas, it begins to develop this kind of self-consciousness. Now, this manas itself is a spiritual principle in its origin. This is like the original mind in Zen or in some schools of Buddhism, or the pure mind. Manas in itself is a spiritual principle. The self-consciousness of manas is very pure. It's not a personal self-consciousness. It's just the awareness of being, of existing. And the mind is a very insightful mind. It's not a mind that is entangled in the process of thinking, reasoning. It's a mind that can perceive things as they are. We all have that potentiality. That is the original mind in us, the pure mind. But the problem is that in the process of incarnation, when this monad, Atma, Buddhi, and Manas, express itself through a body and a complex of emotions, that Manas, which is, let's say, very spiritual, becomes narrowed down to whatever it can do while expressing through the brain. So it is said that manas never incarnates, only a little ray of manas incarnates in the human being. So what happens? This mind, which originally is omniscient, now becomes what we call the lower mind, which is confused. This self-consciousness that was pure now becomes a sense of selfishness. Why? Because this ray of manas begins to work through the brain, and one quality of manas is that it bestows a sense of being on whatever it is, illuminating, let's say. So there is a thought. Thinking is a process that is pretty much mechanical. In the Theosophical view, our body is alive, just as in regular science they say. We use our body, which is a collection of cells. But also our emotions are a collection of elemental forces, which they are alive in themselves. They have their own tendencies, just as our body has its own tendency. Some bodies are more like cold weather, some others like hot weather. It's not that our consciousness does. It's our body. That's the characteristic of the body. Some bodies are lazy, some others are restless. That's the nature of the body itself. Now, because we are identified with the body, we say, I like this or I like that. But also at the emotional level, there is this elemental consciousness, elemental emotional consciousness, which has its own tendencies. So in some people, their emotional body is reactive. In some other people, is apathic. In some other people, is But that is the emotional body that is like that. The same with the mind. The characteristic of the mental body is to produce thoughts. And these thoughts are not really produced by the original manas, but by the original consciousness. The process of thinking can be influenced by manas, but in itself, it is a mechanical process, like an artificial intelligence. We can see that, in the Theosophical literature, you can see it is said, we are going to explore this in our next series, but when a person dies and the soul retires to manas and leaves behind the lower mind and the emotions, this lower mind and emotion becomes like a kind of shell floating on the astral plane. And if that shell gets in touch with a medium or a person that does channeling or something like that, that shell uses the energy from this person and becomes the personality that we knew on Earth, even though the real consciousness is now in Deva Chand, for example. It's in a further stage beyond the plane on which the shell is. And this person, if it is a shell of my personality, it will speak like I do. It will repeat the same ideas that I had here while on Earth, because the process of thinking itself does not belong to the real consciousness. What comes from the real consciousness is the creative aspect. And as I said, the real consciousness can direct the process of thinking to here or there, but it's not really the thinker. So the point is that when this manas is illuminating the personality, every thought that appears assumes the sense of I-ness. Because the quality of manas is to bestow I-ness on whatever it is connected to. So for example, when manas is focused on the personality, this personality acquires a sense of I am this personality. If manas switches and begins to connect with Atma Buddhi, now the monad has a sense of I-ness. The question is that the monad is so subtle that cannot get in touch with any aspect of manas. It can only get in touch with the subtler aspects of manas. The monad can never acquire a gross sense of I-ness or a separate sense of I-ness. It can only acquire the very subtlest and purest sense of being. So what happens is that at the beginning of evolution, the powers of manas are asleep. They are in a potential state. And part of the aim of evolution is to awaken the powers in manas and to develop the potentialities in it. This happens at the beginning of evolution through the process of incarnation. Manas sends a ray to the personality, and all the experiences of the personality begin to knock on the door of manas, so to say, and to ask for a response. We can see something like that in the baby. We use many times this example. The baby at the beginning, it has the seed of mind, but it is dormant. So little, by relating to the environment, the mind begins to awake. First, it awakens to the environment. Then it begins to realize that he is an entity different from the environment, and all the process that we know of. So that happens at the beginning of the evolution. Manas sends a ray, and the ray begins to be awakened by living in a world of strife, separation, of strong individuality. Now, at a certain point, when these lower manas, this is, as I said, the ray is called the lower mind. when this lower manas is awakened, now comes a second step. Because what can be awakened by the regular life, that the regular personal life that most people lead, is only the lower aspect of manas. In Theosophy, manas, the principle of manas is divided, of course, in 7 levels. 4 of them are personal, and 3 of them are impersonal. This is the higher manas. The 3 upper states or planes are the higher manas, these manas that we have here. And the 4 lower are the lower manas, the ray. So through the incarnation, only the lower aspect of manas can be awakened. Once that happens, the second stage, as I was saying, is to begin to awaken the higher levels of manas. So for example, it is said that most humanity so far is aware only on the lowest subplane of manas. You know, we say the lower mind, which is the personal mind, has 4 states or 4 subplanes. The lowest of them is that mind that is completely entangled in the emotions, because below the plane of the mind is a plane of emotions. So the lowest subplane is still very much in touch with the emotions. That means a person that is aware on that plane, the mind is basically driven by the emotions. The mind is applied to satisfy the desires, to defend the personality, etc. Like a teenager, yeah. So most humanity, it is said, that is on this lower plane. Some people in humanity is also on the second subplane, and that kind of people are people who have to use their minds without emotions. For example, it could be a scientist, or it could be a businessman that doesn't have to let the emotions interfere, generally speaking. But that mind, the person is able to leave the emotions aside for the time being, but not in his daily life, because that subplane is still very much in touch with the emotions. So it is an improvement, but it's only, it's not permanent, this association between mind and emotion. And in these people, the problem is that when we talk about emotions, we are talking in this context of personal emotions, not of spiritual emotions. Spiritual emotions come from buddhi, and they reflect on the emotional body. Emotions like compassion, love, unselfishness, or a feeling of sacrifice or giving, they all come from buddhi and reflect on the emotions. When we are saying that the lower mind is entangled with the emotions, we mean the personal emotions. So people who are aware on this second subplane, they may produce a disassociation with the personal emotions for the time being, but because they are not awakening the spiritual aspect, they may become very cold people, you know, or completely lose touch of the emotions, which even though they are personal, they are adding something to the person until that person can tap into the higher emotions. But at any rate, anybody that is beginning to disassociate the emotions from, or to try to stop the influence of their personal emotions on their minds are on this second subplane. Then the third subplane is more impersonal, is less in touch with the emotions, And the fourth subplane is very impersonal. The characteristic is this equanimity that the spiritual path talks about. So spiritual people are trying to go, to the third and fourth subplane. And by spiritual people, I don't mean people who say that practice spirituality. I mean people who really are striving to have a different state of consciousness. Because we all may be in spiritual traditions or following a particular technique and still be really caught in the lower subplanes. So let me take Blavatsky's approach to this, because I think it's interesting for a practical or in a practical sense. She said that there are 3 stages in the consciousness in the monastic consciousness, in the consciousness of our mind. The lower of those 3 is what she called like monastic perception. That would be what we were talking about, the lower subplane, where, it's our normal perception of the world, which is usually entangled with our emotions, prejudices, with our fears, with all that aspect. So this is where most people live. Now she says, the state of consciousness that is above it is what she called volitional perception. This means that now we are trying to have a certain control in our reaction to the environment. In the first stage, we just react. In the second stage is a stage where our mind says, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to get entangled with this. For example, she says, it's the kind of consciousness that you need if you want to disregard pain. You have a certain pain or ache, and you say, okay, it is there, I don't care. I put it aside and keep doing whatever I have to do. Now, with the physical pain, if it is not too strong, it's relatively easy to do. But with emotional pain or mental pain, it is much more difficult to do. So this volitional perception is to try to get to this volitional perception, we need to begin to develop this equanimity. And for that, life itself is a school. Because in our daily life, we have every day things that come to us that tend to upset us, that we don't like, things that happen, that wishes that are not fulfilled, or fears. So to raise our consciousness from the monastic perception to the volitional perception, we need to start actively trying to keep a state of equanimity. So when things come to us, we can examine them, we can observe our reactions, and we can say, there is no point in reacting here. I'll do my best to leave the reaction aside. Of course, to come from this state to the next state may take a lot of effort. Most probably will take a lot of effort. But we have to do it. I mean, we can postpone it, or we can start doing it now. And every time that we try it, even if we fail, that doesn't mean anything. The failure doesn't mean anything. What is important is that we try, and the next time we try again. Because this monastic perception has accumulated an amount of energy. And we cannot just make a certain energy disappear because now we don't like it. This energy has to be exhausted. So to give an example, if we have accumulated 100 reactions, well, we will have to strive against our reactions 100 times. And then as we strive with them, little by little, that energy is exhausted. But there will be 100 reactions. It's not just because now you decide, okay, I will not react to things, you will stop reacting. Now, when you react, and you are aware that you are reacting, and you try not to react, even if you fail, what you are doing is not generating a new cause of reaction for the future. So this is a work that needs patience, needs humility, and confidence. We have to just keep trying it. It's the same with anything. If you are trying to learn to play the piano, you try and then you cannot get it right, and a person that is teaching you will tell you, keep trying. And because we are more used to this on the physical level, we know that by trying, sooner or later, we will be able to do it. But then when it comes to emotional or mental processes, we don't have the same confidence. We think that because we tried it and it didn't work, we are unable to do it. No, it is exactly the same. Try it and you will see that it will, eventually it will be mastered, that particular reaction. Or it may take 6 months, it may take 3 years, or it may take longer. It doesn't matter. As I said, we have to start at a certain point. And what happens is that as we keep trying, it's not something that is all or nothing. I'm using this example about 100 reactions just to give the idea, but little by little the reaction begins to be weaker, and so it's not that we are going to see the result only at the very end. But we have to be ready to have to keep applying our will to begin to be the masters of our own universe. So our emotional body or the emotional elemental will try to react. But as it is said in At the Feet of the Master, the emotional elemental, the body, they are the vehicles of consciousness. They are like a horse. When you are taming a horse, the horse wants to do something else, and you tame it so that the horse can respond to your needs. So in this sense, it is more or less the same. You have to tame the elemental life that we are using to express consciousness so that it can really become a vehicle of consciousness. And in so doing, the elemental consciousness is also evolving. But that is another matter. So once this happens, as the person begins to establish himself, I think that this volitional perception is probably related with the second and third subplanes in those 4 subplanes. This idea of the different subplanes that I'm talking about comes more from Besant and Leadbeater, and Blavatsky was talking in a different way. I think we can correlate it. This volitional perception is probably these 2 subplanes, the middle subplanes in the 4 of the lower mind. And then the upper subplane, the higher state of mind, is what Blavatsky called spiritual conscious apperception. And she explains that apperception is when the perception, or when the attention, she says, is directed to the perception, not to the action. We usually direct our attention to what we are doing. Well, I should say most people are not even directing their attention to what they are doing. They are doing something and their mind is doing something else. That's at the level of the monastic perception. Leadbeater and Besant always insisted that whatever we do in life, we should do it as perfectly as possible and with the fullness of our mind. Because what we begin to do is to develop that volitional perception. We begin to be able to direct our mind wherever we want or it is needed. Now, the spiritual perception is not that our attention is directed to what we are doing, but the attention is directed to the perception of everything. So it's a perception, she says, is a self-perception. It's like a self-consciousness. Gurdjieff would talk about the self-remembering, for example, or self-remembrance. Now, this spiritual perception is not done through thinking. It's not that you repeat yourself, I remember myself, or you don't use a process of thought. You can use it, as a practice, probably to switch little by little from the volitional to the spiritual perception. So you can use thinking and all that, but essentially the spiritual perception is a state of witnessing. It's a state where we are beyond the thinker, beyond the process of thinking. So when we get to what happens usually is that our consciousness is most of the time on one particular state, and with practice we begin to experience the other state here and there. As we keep practicing, we begin to establish our normal consciousness on that higher plane, and we begin to touch the other one, the one that is above it. So it's a process, but once our consciousness is established on the higher one, on the spiritual perception, then we are very close to the higher manas. Then there is a possibility of realizing our true I-ness. Not our true self. The true self would be Atman, which is a universal self. That is a further realization. But the first realization is to realize the original mind, that pure I-ness, which is not selfish, which is not separate. It's the union of the lower self and the lower ego and the higher ego. So when we are in life, if we keep in mind this, I like Blavatsky's diagram because to me it's very simple and we can keep it in mind. You can say, in what state am I at the moment? Am I just reacting? Am I trying to, be the actor and not just a reactor? Or am I in a state of witnessing? You will see that when the reactions are strong, it's very difficult to stay in a state of witnessing because the emotions drag us to, all the turmoil. So probably the first thing we have to do is to try to take control of the emotions, not in the sense of repressing. Repression comes when we don't recognize what is there, when we don't want to see, when we push it almost unconsciously. What we are talking about here, controlling, is recognizing and recognizing also the foolishness, if you want to say in that way, of reacting, in the sense that we never accomplish anything by reacting. If we are asked in a cool state, we would never choose reacting. So reacting is something that overcomes us. So the idea is that when we are in life, we can try to begin to take control of the reactions. And then as that happens, we will discover that we are more and more able to stay in this state of awareness where we are witnesses of what happens, witnesses of our emotions, our thoughts. And we can use our daily life for that, for any of this. We don't need to do it when we are sitting in a cushion in meditation. I mean, of course, we can do that there. it may be easier from a certain point of view just to watch our thoughts when they are not being bombarded by things. So we can start there, but we need to extend this to the whole of our life. So to finish with this part, and then we can do some comments and questions. The idea is that as we do this, what we are really doing is we begin to awaken the higher states or aspects of our mind. And the monad, Atma Buddhi, as we are going to see in the next series, after we die, the monad enters into a state or a process where it tries to absorb the purest aspect of manas that was awakened. So if after our incarnation we have established or touched the highest aspects of manas, all this will be absorbed by the monad. So little by little, incarnation after incarnation, the monad that began being Atma Buddhi and just connected to manas will absorb the higher manas and will become what we call in Theosophy the triple monad or Atma Buddhi manas. This means that manas, which is the self-consciousness, is now not united to the personality, but to the divine spark. So manas is not the sense of I am the personality. Manas is the sense of I am the divine. When manas is united to Atma Buddhi, we have what we call an enlightened being, or a jnani, or a liberated person. And that is, I think, one of the essential aspects of evolution. The monad absorbing the highest manas. And that's why all the spiritual practices tend to help us go from this reacting mind to a mind that is in control, and to a mind that is, or a consciousness that is observing, that is witnessing. So we can stop here and see if there are any comments or questions. And if we have some more time, we can discuss some other things.
So the way I understand it is the lower mind is the more personal. It collects experiences from earth life, and then when we die, some aspect of that goes up to the higher manas. But I guess how does it, what goes and what stays?
Well, what I said, we are going to see all this in the next series. There is like a sorting out of the personal aspect and the impersonal aspect of manas, the one that was activated or awakened during that particular life. The personal aspect is left behind and forms the shell that I was talking about. The impersonal aspect is absorbed by the higher manas. Now, the impersonal aspect is also of different degrees. So some part is impersonal, but is still personal, so to say. I think that the purest activity in our mind is the one that can really be absorbed by the monad. When there is not sense of I-ness in the sense that we usually feel it. And this happens in many occasions, or may happen in many occasions, even with physical actions. When we do something absolutely for the sake of the moment or the situation, and not looking for anything for ourselves, we are activating manas that can be used by them or absorbed by the monad. when we feel love in a completely impersonal way, that sometimes we do, that is also something that will be absorbed by the monad. Or when we live in this state of consciousness where we are not identifying ourselves with our personality, again, that will be absorbed by the monad.
So an example could be when somebody asks for help. If we stop and think, how is this going to help me? Is this going to take time out of my day? How is this going to affect me? That's thinking from our lower manas. So when we reach the state where somebody needs help and we forget all about those things, how it will affect us, then that's reacting from higher manas. And that's the type of stuff that goes on.
Yes, but at the beginning, we may need to do all that thinking, because there are actually 3 stages there. The first one would be somebody needs help, I don't want to do it, blah, blah, blah. The second stage is, yes, I feel that, which is not I, my emotional elemental doesn't want to be bothered. My mental elemental, so they will say, no, this is so much bother, just stay, do something you want. The reaction will be there, but then we are starting on the volitional perception and we say, wait, I can do that later, or this is needed, and then you do it in spite of what your tendency says. So even though that is not purely spiritual, so to say, you are still, climbing the next step.
It's working on it.
Yeah. And eventually, it will become this spontaneous action that you are talking about.
Right. One of the things that I was thinking of when you talked about these 3 stages was when I hear, these words and I get these definitions, I try to put them in order. I have my goal of getting to the volitional perception or onto the spiritual. I'm going to get there. If I line all these things up and I put everything in order, then all I have to do is believe and I can just do it. And so then I notice I get really, really disappointed when you say 6 months or 3 years, to stop reacting to stuff. I think I'm working more like on 25 years.
No.
Yeah.
That's fine. I don't want to, discourage
depress anybody.
people.
Yeah.
But it depends. There are some reactions that we may bring for, a number of lives. And it doesn't matter. Time, although for us is so real.
Oh, yeah, it does matter.
Yeah. Although for us it's so real, time is an illusion because we have to do it. And, I remember when I was 14, I think I read the first article about self-improvement. I don't remember. It was something probably more related to the New Age. But so I did my calculation and I said, well, maybe it will take me 6 years to do this. And I said, I'm going to be 20 years old. I won't need any of this. Why? That's a lot of time. By that time, who knows? Of course, when I was 20 years, I was still in the same. And I said, I wish I would. So my point is that the idea that the future is far away is just an idea. Because we are always present at whatever moment. So time is really an illusion. We have to do it without thinking when it is going to produce a fruit.
Right,
and it will. And when it does, that's our present.
Right, and I think the other downside is comparing ourselves to other people. We see people doing the same. I see people who have 3 kids, who work and who do everything that I do, and I don't see them reacting the way that I seem to be reacting. And so when I make that comparison, that just increases my amount of suffering. So,
comparison is
right. That's what I'm saying.
Absolutely.
You can't do it, but that's what we do on a regular basis.
Because again, some people have an emotional body that is more reactive than others. And non-reaction doesn't mean that the person is beyond the manasic perception.
Right.
Because in that particular person, non-reaction is just, again, going with whatever their nature is. So when we talk about volitional perception, we are talking about going beyond your conditioning, whatever it is. You may be conditioned to be calm, and it's not that you are calm because you are in a higher state of consciousness. It's just because your emotional body is dull, or whatever it is. So there is no purpose. When we talk about Dharma, we are going to see this. Krishna said in the Bhagavad Gita, to follow somebody else's Dharma is the worst thing you can do. You have to follow your Dharma, even if the Dharma of another person seems to be higher. The idea of Dharma is like, it's very difficult to translate, but what you should do, your path in life, your mission. No, there is no possibility of comparison. It's just like trying to compare an orange and an apple. So you say, why that orange is so orange and I'm red or green? And, please drop any kind of comparison.
Right. So that would be actually a really good first step, is to try and drop that.
It sounds like the perfect place to be is the witness. I think becoming the witness shortens whatever that needs to be removed, but to be able to stand firmly as a witness. My emotions are, but anyways, working on that. But to be a witness removes the reaction, and I'm able to move a little bit better but witnessing at each point to become that witness.
Yeah, this is, any model that we use is useful to a certain extent and is artificial from another point of view. This is a living process. But yeah, we should tend probably to first to be aware of our reactions or conditionings or fears or whatever is there, then to try not to let those things to come in our way, and then we should try to be beyond and see that we are none of that, not even the one that is trying to control. So, if we start seeing life, because how do you overcome fear? Not merely by wishing it. You have to be in front of whatever you are afraid of and see that you can face it. So how are we going to establish ourselves in this volitional perception? It's only by facing the reactions or whatever happens that we don't like and saying, yeah, my emotional body doesn't like it and I don't care, because at this point this has to be done. So we have to, there is no other way to develop these things that by going through the experience. We shouldn't shrink from the experience, because that is the only way we can discover what we really are eventually.
As we move up the ladder, would it be possible to fall backwards, or do we constantly keep moving up? Yeah,
that's why I said this is a process, and we are constantly going back and forth. Well, some people probably never get to the higher state. Some other people very rarely get to the lower state. Some other people maybe, back and forth in all of them. This is a process. So when we are talking about these things, for example, where your consciousness is established, that doesn't mean that this is a room, you are here, and therefore you are never there or there. It means that for the most part, you live in that state of consciousness. But many times things happen that you either go up or down, if we want to take this model. So yeah, take it, this is something, it's a process. Don't take it too structurally.
I think this is a wonderful strategy for us to use in assessing our lower mind and the way it works, because we're mostly concerned with ourself, I. But I think it's also a very good strategy in helping us assess how other people react. if you can see that the other person is reacting to their reactions, then you see it as a reaction. And I think it helps you deal with that reaction as a reaction. So not only can you keep in mind this process as you feel it, but you can almost observe or be the witness when it's happening to other people, because we are all reflections of the same. So we can see that same reaction in other people too.
Yeah, that's very true. And when we start seeing it in ourselves, then we begin to understand what happens in other people. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from the internet. How does meditation fit into this practice of tapping into the monastic higher minds?
That's the other aspect that we could talk, but
Is there any
we
other-
will talk about this at some other series. But basically, meditation, it depends on what you are meaning by meditation. You know, under the word meditation, there are many different exercises that are put in the same category. But the idea is that in meditation, just to begin with trying to concentrate your mind, you begin to work on this volitional perception. You begin to work on, you know, controlling your mind and your emotions and all that. But then you start meditating and you start thinking about that particular object of meditation. And eventually, in the Theosophical approach, the idea is that at a certain point you have to drop any particular thinking process or visualizing or repeating a mantra or whatever you are doing. You drop it and you just stay in a state of silent witnessing. So the process of meditation is taking you from the normal reactive state of mind to one where you start disregarding the things that are not appropriate, and eventually to this state of witnessing. So the same with study, you know, because these lower subplanes are constantly stimulated by the normal life in which we are concerned with keeping or making sure that our body, our family, the concrete things survive. So the higher aspect of our mind that is concerned with universals, with spiritual things, with things that go beyond the personal, are rarely stimulated in the normal daily life. So the study of spiritual literature may be an aid to stimulate the higher aspects of our mind, because we are studying things that are not necessarily concerned with our personality. Although we can turn anything into a selfish, activity, and then, of course, when we are studying spirituality, we are trying to see how that can transform my life. But it can be done in a selfish way, or it can be done in an impersonal way.
Where are we when we're solving a Sudoku problem?
Well, I think, the idea is that all purely mental processes are trying to take the mind from that entanglement with emotions up. So it is said that mathematicians and scientists, they are stimulating the higher subplanes of their consciousness, because it requires a more abstract kind of thinking. But if in their daily life they are selfish and aggressive, that doesn't produce any change. So unless you are 24 hours solving the Sudoku, that could be a form of meditation that is taking you away from